Morning, government class. It is Monday, April 13th, and this week we're going to be talking about the role of the federal or national government in setting domestic policy. By domestic policy, we're contrasting that with foreign policy, which is basically how the government of the United States interacts with other countries, be it through war or through diplomacy or whatnot. And foreign policy is the sole area of the federal government. Okay, we don't go to war as the state of Oklahoma. California doesn't declare war on Japan during World War II or something like that. It's the federal government that deals with all things having to do with foreign policy. But domestic policy is a little bit different. Domestic policy is just things that have to do with our life here at home in the United States. So, our guiding question for the week, and this is something that's very timely for us, is what role does the national government play in imposing the COVID-19 lockdown or quarantines? In other words, we're all, for the most part around the country, being required or asked, but in most cases required, to stay home as much as possible. Obviously, most state schools are closed, parks are closed, things like that. But what is the role of the national government in actually doing that? President Trump has been talking for about a week now about the idea that he's going to have the, kind of a grand reopening of the country. May 1st, I think, is now the current target date that he's talking about for that. We're going to reopen the country. Everyone's going to go back to work. Everyone's going to go back to school. The problem with that being that the quarantines and lockdowns haven't come from the federal government. They've come from state and local governments. So Oklahoma has not had a particular statewide lockdown in the way that a lot of states, including California, have done. But in Tulsa, Mayor G.T. Bynum locked down the city several weeks ago. That was a local city decision that the mayor took. Mayor of Oklahoma City's done the same thing. Mayor of Broken Arrow, Claremore's here. The Claremore and the mayor and city council have kind of a different government setup here, but they've locked down Claremore as well, so we're in quarantine too. What role would the federal government or the national government have in telling states or cities that have locked themselves down to lift quarantine or lift bans on gatherings of more than 10 people, say? This is a federalism issue. It's a question of, okay, does the president of the United States have the right to tell California to send everyone back to work, or to tell Oklahoma's schools, hey, you have to reopen your buildings starting in May? Does the president have that right? And I think the general answer to that is no. But what role would the federal government have in imposing these kinds of lockdowns, and what role do the states and local governments have? So that's what I kind of want you to be thinking about while we're talking about this. This week particularly, we're going to be talking about interest groups. And interest groups tend to get a bad name in our politics. Oh, that's these interest groups, running around wanting to make changes and laws and everything. Interest groups are simply groups that want to make changes to laws like anybody else. And, the idea being in a democracy that the more numbers you have on your side, the better off you are. The more organized you are if you want to change a law or add a law to the state or national constitution, that if you organize and you get more people on your side, the better your chances of seeing this change that you want. And those get called special interest groups, these organizations and whatnot. Like I say, they get a bad name, but they're really the most effective way for groups of people to come together and to participate in a democratic republic like what we have. Okay, so talking about the role of interest groups, where do you stand on the question of gun control? What about global warming, campaign finance reform, abortion, prayer in public schools? What can you do to promote your views on these and other public questions? How can you increase the chance that your positions will carry the day? Joining with others who share your opinions is both practical and democratic. Organization can provide the route to power, and organized efforts to further group interests are a fundamental part of the democratic process. Moreover, the right to do so is protected by the Constitution. Remember, the First Amendment guarantees, quote, the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. This is what redress of grievances means. I have a grievance. I see something that I think is wrong. I want to change that, or I want to affect this issue in a way that I think needs affecting. Therefore, I'm going to join with other like-minded people and work to get this policy or this law put into place. Interest groups are sometimes called pressure groups, and often organized interests or special interests. They try to influence what government does in some specific area of special interest to them. They give themselves a variety of labels: leagues, associations, clubs, federations, unions, committees, and so on. But whatever they call themselves, every interest group seeks to influence the making and content of public policy. This is Democracy 101. This is basic stuff. If you live in a democracy, you have to be able and willing to participate in it in order to bring about the promise of what democracy is all about. Otherwise, we might as well live under King George III still. Used in this general sense, public policy includes all of the goals that a government pursues in the many areas of human affairs in which it is involved. Everything from seatbelts, speed limits, and zoning to flood control, old age pensions, and the use of military force in international affairs. Because interest groups exist to shape public policy, they can be found wherever those policies are made or can be influenced. They operate at every level of government, on Capitol Hill and elsewhere in Washington, D.C., in every one of the 50 state capitals, in thousands of city halls and county courthouses, and in many other places at the local level all across the country. In short, as diplomat and historian Lord Bryce put it somewhat indelicately more than a century ago, where the body is, there will the vultures be gathered. Remember, our society is pluralistic. It is not dominated by any one elite. It is instead composed of several distinct cultures and groups. Increasingly, the members of various ethnic, racial, religious, and other groups compete for and share in the exercise of political power in the United States. U.S. history classes right now are talking about the Civil Rights Movement. And if looking at this definition of interest groups, you could define those who were fighting in the 50s and 60s for African American voting rights, African American civil rights, the end of Jim Crow segregation. You could define those people or those groups as interest groups or pressure groups. We don't usually define them in that way. Hold on. Got a sneeze coming. Anyway, okay. So that's on my mind, how the civil rights movement could be viewed as a pressure group or an interest group. But that's all a pressure or an interest group is someone that says, hey, this thing is wrong, or we ought to change this. There ought to be a law. They organize, get other people together of like mind, and go about trying to do that. So, and what the book is talking about here, increasingly the members of various ethnic, racial, religious, and other groups compete for and share in the exercise of political power. That's what that is. That's exactly what it's describing is the civil rights movement, by way of example, and the fact that, since the civil rights movement, there have been a number of people, thinking of Congressman John Lewis in Georgia, who was very active as a young man in the civil rights movement, was beaten almost to death a couple of times during the civil rights movement, and has been in Congress, has represented Metro Atlanta in Congress for generations now. That's political power. That's a group sharing in political power. Interest groups are made up of people who join together for some political purpose, much like political parties. Parties and interest groups overlap in a number of ways. They differ from each other in three significant ways, however. One, with respect to the making of nominations. Two, in their basic focus. and 3, in the scope of their interests. First, parties nominate candidates for public office. Interest groups do not. Recall, the making of nominations is a prime function of political parties. If an interest group were to nominate candidates, it would in effect become a political party. Interest groups do not attempt to affect the outcome of primaries and other nominating contests. They do not pick candidates who then run for office under their labels, however. It may be widely known that a particular interest group supports this or that candidate, but the candidate seeks votes as a Republican or as a Democrat. So let's say that you are pro-choice on the question of abortion. Then there's not a political party that's labeled, the pro-choice party that you could run for their nomination for whatever political office. But the two main political parties in the country, Democrats and Republicans, have taken fairly steady stances on this question, just by way of example. So if you are a pro-choice candidate and you're looking for a party to be a member of and to seek a nomination from, you're more likely to choose the Democratic Party than you would be to choose the Republican Party, which is not as pro-choice, certainly, as the Democratic Party is. So this is a big difference between interest groups, say National Abortion Rights Action League, or NARAL. That's an interest group. The Democratic Party would be the party that you might join if you are a pro-choice candidate, just by way of example. Okay. Second, parties are chiefly interested in winning elections and thereby controlling government. Interest groups are chiefly concerned with controlling or influencing the policies of government. Unlike parties, those groups do not face the problems involved in trying to appeal to the largest possible number of people. In short, political parties are mostly interested in the who, and interest groups are mostly concerned with the what of government. To put it another way, parties focus mostly on the candidate. Interest groups focus mostly on policy questions. And so this comes about a lot. You see this in presidential elections where in, say, 2016, a lot of people were concerned with or talking about the policies that were being championed by Hillary Clinton, by Donald Trump. But really, from the political voting point of view, that policy position, the idea of, well, what would Hillary Clinton do in office? What policies would Donald Trump take in office? Those really paled by comparison to who these people were, kind of their style over their substance. So that was a much more of a party affiliation vote than an interest group or a subject matter vote. Third, political parties are necessarily concerned with the whole range of public affairs, with everything of concern to voters. Interest groups almost always concentrate only on those issues that most directly affect the interests of their members. In addition, interest groups are private organizations. Unlike political parties, they are not accountable to the public. Their members, not the voters, pass judgment on their performance. So, if you ever hear someone talking about they're a single issue voter, if you're pro-choice or you're anti-abortion, a lot of times with people, that might be the one issue that they really consider in choosing who to vote for. Guns are another way. Second Amendment is another way. If you are for some restrictions on gun ownership, if you are for no restrictions on gun ownership, that can influence, especially if that's kind of the one issue that you really think about when you go to vote, that can really have a big influence on who you're going to vote for. But there again, the NRA, the National Rifle Association, is not a political party. It's an interest group, but it has a very strong identification with one political party in general, which is the Republican Party, not the Democrats. So this is kind of a beginning intro to how interest groups affect how domestic policy gets made And we're going to be keeping talking about this for the next several days. And I want you to think about what particular interest groups might be pushing for reopening, quote unquote, reopening society. Who in the country would benefit from saying, okay, schools are back in session, all the businesses are open, we're going to do away with all restrictions on public gatherings, on restaurants and things like that. We're going to open the whole country up. Who would benefit from that? Who do you think would want to be pushing President Trump to try to get the country to open again on May 1st? Anyway, I'll be back tomorrow with more, and talk to you guys later.